All right, so we are very lucky to have our program today led by Bill Tyre from Glessner House. He is very familiar with the Pullman story. He is incredibly knowledgeable about all things Prairie Avenue, and so he's going to talk to us a bit about that because when the town of Pullman was built in 1880, it was built from scratch. There was prairie land here. Everything was designed from the ground up. And as the town was built, there was plans for homes for everyone except for one very important resident that you think would be here, George Pullman. Because George Pullman did not live in Pullman. He lived on Prairie Avenue with the other folks of the Gilded Age, very influential Chicago families. And we are going to learn all about what their home was like from Bill. So I am going to mute myself. I will be off camera while I hand it over to Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today to share one of my favorite topics. The Pullman House is huge and we don't have a lot of time, so let's get started. So, George Pullman and Hattie Sanger were married in June of 1867. He was living on the near south side at that time, but they soon purchased a house which stood at 16th and Michigan Avenue, shown here. This is where they were living at the time of the Chicago fire, so they were not burnt out. And it was also here that their 4 children were born. Their daughter Florence, of course, for whom the hotel is named, daughter Harriet, and then twin boys, George and Sanger, that you see at right. In 1868, Pullman actually purchased property on Prairie Avenue. This is shown with the arrow at upper left. He purchased it from Wirt Dexter, a prominent attorney who was living next door, and he paid $500 per front foot. It was the highest price ever paid for a residential lot at that time. You'll see that the property backed up to the Illinois Central Railroad tracks. And then the other arrow near the bottom shows an additional piece of property he acquired where he constructed this L-shaped building that we will see in a little bit. Plans for the house were prepared by an architect named Henry Jaffray, who had trained under Richard Morris Hunt in New York City. The massive house was faced in Connecticut brownstone, measured 70 by 108 feet, which amounted to a little over 7,000 square feet per floor. Construction took several years, and the family did not move in until January of 1876, but it was another year before the interiors were completed. An early newspaper article said that the house was more beautiful than the gardens of Kashmir. Here we see the drawing room of the house with Harriet and her daughter Florence sitting in the foreground. The carpet that you see underneath the bare rug was Aubusson and was woven in France to match the elaborate stenciled ceiling. The carpet alone was said to have cost $15,000 to produce. In addition to all of the standard rooms you would expect in a large house, the mansion also featured a bowling alley and a billiard room and several large spaces for entertaining. A newspaper article said, quote, "The home of Mr. and Mrs. George M. Pullman is undoubtedly the most notable social center in Chicago. Their parlor is the magnet for the wealthiest, wittiest, and most favored in the town." In anticipation of their daughter Harriet's wedding in 1892, extensive renovations were made, including the addition of terraces, a palm room, and an enlarged coach house, which is basically everything you see in the right half of this image looking from Calumet Avenue. Fortunately, the house was well documented shortly before it was torn down. And using those photographs, I was able to reconstruct this floor plan. And we're going to be walking through the house room by room. When you first arrived at the house, you would have been confronted with these massive walnut doors with bronze decoration on them. And the reason this looks like a modern image is because it is. You will hear in a little bit that a lot of the pieces of the house itself were salvaged before the house was torn down. These doors were saved, and if you would like to see them in person, you need to travel to Las Vegas and visit the Main Street Casino. This would have been the view once you were admitted through the front doors, the main hall with large rooms off to either side. And we're going to start with the Egyptian room, which is off to the right in this photo. Here's a view looking into that room. There were several different themed rooms. Egyptian style and Egyptian revival was very popular at the time, leading to the decoration of this particular room that was decorated largely in yellow. Here we see another image showing the fireplace. There were at least 7 large fireplaces on the first floor alone. And here we see a view looking the other direction. And I use this photo in particular because I'd like you to look at that glassed-in bookcase you see on the right-hand side of the image. This was another piece that was salvaged prior to the demolition of the house. You can see that, in fact, all the trim and built-ins in this particular room was all done in black with gilded highlights, such as the Sphinx heads you see to either side. Here are a few details from that cabinet. And also at upper right, you will see this is from the back side of the cabinet. All of the pieces that were made for the house were made by a firm called Prairie and Stylus, a very high-end interior decorating firm in New York. And every piece that was made for the Pullman mansion would receive a distinct 5-digit number. And this would be used when everything was shipped to Chicago so that everything could be assembled and put into place in exactly the right position. Going back into the main hall, we're now looking towards the back part of that space. We'll look at the main staircase in a moment. But I want you to note the elaborate decoration over the doorway that is straight ahead. And here is one of those pieces. Multiple different woods were used throughout the house. The main hall was done in walnut with burled walnut veneer, as you can see here. And this is among the pieces owned by the Historic Pullman Foundation. Turning to the side, we see the main staircase again, which is kind of tucked off to the side. And then if you look farther to the right, you will see those large leaded glass doors. This is actually the entrance out into what was known as the porte cochere, where the carriages could pull up. If you arrived by carriage and opened those doors, this would have been the view into the house. This entryway or hallway was set beneath the staircase. And then you can just see a little bit off to the sides, but to either side was actually a fountain that was illuminated with electric lights and banked and surrounded by ferns and palms. We're now moving into what would have been the largest room on the first floor. This would have been Mrs. Pullman's drawing room. It was decorated in pale blue brocade with white and gold trim in the Louis XVI style. And major events like weddings and funerals would have taken place here. You see a surviving pedestal from beneath one of those columns off to the right, again in the HPF collection. This is actually one of the pieces of furniture from the room that was made by Prairie and Stylus. This recently came up for auction, which is how I was able to acquire this image. And again, it was positively identified because it did have the Pullman name and 5-digit number on the underside. Here's another view of the drawing room. In 1888, the Chicago Times said, in point of location, size, and architecture, it surpasses any room of its kind in Chicago, whether public or private. There were several musical instruments in the room, including the white grand piano you see off to the left, as well as several large oil paintings, including Mrs. Pullman's favorite, which was called Happy Moments by Adolphe Bouguereau, shown at lower right. Off of the drawing room would have been the organ room. The organ was installed at the time of the wedding of their daughter Florence in 1896 and was made by their neighbor, William Kimball. To the other side of the organ room would have been the dining room. Obviously, the table is shown closed here, but could be opened to full length to seat quite a few individuals. This was at the back of the house, so two of the windows would have actually had unobstructed views out onto Lake Michigan with nothing in between except some railroad tracks. This is a view of the dining room looking the other direction. And what I'd like to point out here is the very large built-in sideboard that you see on the right-hand side. This is one of the larger pieces that was salvaged from the house. You can see it on the left as it is currently displayed in the HPF exhibit hall, and then some detail shots here. And of course, this is also the work of Potier and Steinus. We're now going to be moving into the wing that was added in 1892. So this is directly back from the dining room. We are looking straight ahead into Mr. Pullman's library towards the fireplace. And all of the wood in this room was ebony, so it was also black, like the Egyptian room that we saw earlier. Here's another view of that space. Of course, after dinners, typically the ladies and the men would separate, and so Pullman would bring his male friends back to this part of the house. Opening directly into the library and almost an extension of it was this space seen here, which was referred to as the billiard room. The large table you see sitting in the middle of the room had a mahogany top to it, so it could be used as a table, but when needed, that top could come off, and then you would have the billiard table in place underneath. Here's another view looking the opposite, or actually the same direction. And if you look closely at that table, you can see in the corners hanging down are the fabric pockets for the billiard table. You'll see a portrait of George Pullman off to the far right. Continuing on through the billiard room, we got to one of the most magnificent spaces in the house, which was this enormous palm room. The walls were covered with sienna marble and inlaid mosaics. The dome, which you just get a hint of at the upper right, was nearly 40 feet high and was of leaded glass. Here's a view looking the opposite direction in that room, and here we can see the large panels of marble and the intricate mosaics up above with these vine designs. Going back into the main house for a moment, we go into what was known as the Red Room. It was actually a combination of two rooms that was remodeled because one of these spaces was Pullman's original library before the addition. But you'll see several large portraits here, George and Hattie Pullman on the back wall. And then looking the other direction, we see the large portrait of their daughter, Harriet, off to the far left. There are almost no views of the upper floors of the house. This is actually the second floor stair hall, which would have led up to the ballroom. And then the only view we have from one of the bedrooms, this was immediately next to that staircase we just saw. And we believe this is actually what would have been Hattie Pullman's sitting room. Her closest friends would be invited into this more intimate space when they would visit. There are some surviving pieces from other bedrooms. The piece at upper left was sold at auction in recent years, and it shows a style of furniture that was meant to imitate bamboo, although it is obviously not made out of that. This was kind of part of the interest of Japanese and more exotic design. And there is a surviving piece from this room of the window trim that you see at lower right, part of the HPF collection. So now we're once again looking at the house from the Calumet side. It kind of in the middle, you can see that enormous leaded glass dome of the palm room that we looked at, the very, very large stable off to the right. Pullman was especially known for his wonderful horses and carriages. And here we have another view. The floors of the terrace were actually all done in beautiful mosaic designs. There's not a good surviving photo, just some written descriptions. And then looking across the street, if you remember that map I showed before, there was that large L-shaped building on the south side of 18th. And this included his very, very large greenhouse that you see to the right here. Very rare, very exotic plants. He was said to have some ferns that were 500 years old. And then the other kind of support buildings around that. It was almost like a private park. And again, all of this is facing directly towards Lake Michigan. So daughter Harriet was married in 1892. In the house, the scale of the wedding was reduced due to the death of Pullman's mother just beforehand. As a result, only 300 people were invited, as opposed to 1,000 that was on the original list. And it was noted George Pullman was not actually very happy with the marriage. Although Harriet's new husband came from a good family in San Francisco, Pullman was concerned. At the wedding, he gave his new son-in-law $25,000 and told him to, quote, make something of himself. Pullman was very proud of the fact that one of Chicago's earliest historic events took place on his property. You can see his stable off to the left here before it was remodeled, but immediately next to his home was this large tree, which historically was known as the Fort Dearborn Massacre tree. It was the site of a battle between the residents of Fort Dearborn who were leaving the fort during the War of 1812. There was a brief skirmish with the native Potawatomi. Quite a few of the party and many of the Native Americans were killed, including their chief. And this tree was said to be standing at that time. By the early 1890s, the tree was clearly dying, and Pullman wanted to find a way to preserve this site and its moment in Chicago history. And so he commissioned the Danish sculptor Carl Roll Smith to create this monument. With the base, it stood 19 feet tall, so quite a commanding presence. Today, this is viewed in a very different light because it obviously does not depict the Native Americans in a very positive light, as they were attempting to preserve their native lands. And so the event is now known as the Battle of Fort Dearborn. Here we get a sense of the scale of the monument. Pullman actually later regretted installing the monument because he said so many people came to see it, they would picnic on his lawn, they would leave behind litter and that sort of thing, but there it was, and it always remained a very popular site to visit. The tree finally came down during a heavy storm in May of 1894. People quickly came to cut pieces off of the tree. A couple of Pullman's staff members were able to pull 2 large sections of it onto his lawn, one of which was eventually donated to the Chicago Historical Society. Of course, this was during the Pullman strike, so one of the newspapers noted that the old massacre tree has actually joined the strike too. Not surprisingly, someone in Pullman's position would occasionally have issues. This was an individual, Simon Reskin, who was arrested after throwing a large stone through the front window of the Pullman mansion. This, again, was during the strike. But the family was away during the strike. Pullman sent his family and all of the female servants away from Chicago for their safety, so nobody was hurt. The next year, this is from a newspaper article that talked about bombs being sent to not only Pullman, but also his neighbor on Prairie Avenue, Philip Armour, the meat packer. Someone had tipped off that this was happening, and so the bombs were not delivered to the houses. They were sent to the offices instead and safely dismantled. On a happier note, in 1896, we do have the wedding of Pullman's favorite daughter, Florence. It was one of the grand social events of the year. On the right, we see the bodice that she is wearing, which is actually studded with pearls and diamonds. She had to be sewn into it for the wedding event. A total of 1,600 people were invited to the wedding at the house. The reception and the dinner, the sit-down portion of the dinner was for several hundred people. There were 2 orchestras, and it was really quite an amazing event. The next year, Florence and her husband, Frank Loudon, who went on to become governor of Illinois, provided Pullman with his first grandchild, who they named George Mortimer Pullman Loudon. By that time, Pullman's health was declining, and after returning to Chicago in October of 1897, he felt tired and overworked. He may have sensed the end was near. Just before this time, he had purchased a burial plot at Graceland Cemetery and updated his will. On October 19th, 1897, he died from a massive heart attack in his Prairie Avenue house. Florence was in Chicago, but his wife and other daughter were summoned from other parts of the country. The funeral was conducted from the house on October 23rd. The house was swarmed on the outside by the curious. Messages of sympathy were received from around the world. His estate was estimated at $7 to $12 million, and that included $1.25 million for the establishment of a free manual training school in Pullman. Here we see the Pullman Monument at Graceland Cemetery. There was quite a bit of concern that an attempt would be made to steal or desecrate the body. So elaborate steps were taken to encase it in concrete and railroad ties and other things, and placing it under this 40-foot column so that he would remain undisturbed. His wife continued to live in the house with a much smaller staff. At its peak, the staff was about 24. She downsized to about 15 or so, but still had a full-time person whose sole job was to wind and maintain her valuable collection of clocks. She maintained an extensive suite at the Raymond Hotel, one of the most exclusive in the country, which was in Pasadena, California. Her neighbors in the hotel included the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and J.P. Morgans. And it was here that she died in March of 1921. Her body was brought back to her Chicago home, and the funeral was the last public event ever held in the house. The Pullman Company sent a reproduction of her private railroad car built out of flowers. Honorary pallbearers included Robert Todd Lincoln, Cyrus McCormick Jr., Samuel Insull, and Charles Dawes, vice president. Here we see the drawing room in late November of 1921, when the contents of the legendary house were sold off over the course of 3 days. The family kept some items, but most things were simply put up for sale, including, as we have seen, all of the actual architectural components of the building itself. Newspapers noted that one item that was not for sale was Mrs. Pullman's beloved Airedale, Bosco. And Bosco was locked away after it was discovered that every time the hammer went down, he started barking. And he was given to Minnie Griffin, who had worked as her personal maid for 30 years. Oops, something's happening here. Let me, let's see. I seem to be frozen up here. There we go. All right. So here we see the house during demolition. That would have been during the summer of 1922. The decline of the neighborhood during the previous 2 decades led to the discussion amongst the family to have the house demolished, as opposed to converted to other uses like boarding houses and offices, which had happened to other houses on the street. During the 1933 World's Fair, which took place immediately to the east, the land was used as a parking lot. Shortly after the demolition of the house, the monument was removed from the site. It belonged to the Chicago Historical Society and is still technically in their collection, although no longer on public display. Eventually, this large bus garage was built on the site of the Pullman Mansion. And this is what many people remember seeing up until about the year 2000. There was still a small section of Pullman's wall, which stood along Calumet Avenue, so people could still see what this brownstone looked like, but this came down in 2002 during the redevelopment of the site. As they were excavating, they found that the foundation of the house was actually still intact. You can see the limestone walls here, but they were simply dismantled and the land was filled in to prepare for the townhouses and condo tower that stand on that site today. So that brings to a conclusion our look at the Pullmans, their home on Prairie Avenue, and a wonderful glimpse into the Gilded Age of Chicago. Thank you.
Oh my